On today's World Insight, chances of a reset in trade transatlantic ties between the U.S. and Europe under a Biden administration. How likely and what will it take? And after the 15-nation RCEP trade deal in the bag, one of China's trade negotiators talks about the importance and hurdles of free trade.
The real liberalization level for trading goods is much higher than 90%.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We begin today with a look at the EU summit on Thursday and Friday. A draft EU plan proposes a fresh post-Trump alliance with the United States. Though the power transition of President-elect Joe Biden encountered massive challenges, the EU and most of the bloc states have congratulated him and see Biden as the beacon of hope to ease the tensions of the Trump era. During his presidency, Trump added more tariffs on European countries, belittled NATO, and withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal as part of his America First foreign policy. Europeans worried things will get worse. The European Union on Monday invited President-elect Joe Biden to rebuild transatlantic ties and urged him to join a long-term strategic dialogue that would address global issues, including COVID-19 and climate change. But how will they rebuild ties? Let's turn to our panelists to learn more. For more on U.S.-EU ties, joining us in Chapel Hill, Klaus Laris, distinguished professor from the History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Washington, D.C., Gary Martin, senior professorial lecturer from the American University and co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center. In also Washington, D.C., Ivan Eland, senior fellow, director of the Center for Peace and Liberty at Independent Institute. When we are looking forward to also joining us, a Chinese scholar later in the program. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So what's going on with the latest discussion between the UK and the EU? How should we see the temporary press coverage of the results? Mr. Martin, would you help us to understand better?
The circus phase of negotiations now. Everybody wants to look strong, and nobody wants to be looking as if they're backing down. But it is really getting towards crunch town in these negotiations between the UK and the EU. The differences remain quite significant, especially over issues of a level playing field and over fishing rights. I think the odds of reaching an agreement are really starting to fade. I think the problem is you have a lot of domestic pressure, especially, I would say, on Boris Johnson, who has to face his own party, who really wants a hard Brexit and is worried about making any concessions. And I think also patience has worn thin within the EU 27, who are excruciatingly tired of this ongoing saga for 4 years, especially in the current environment where there's so many other problems. So I am more and more pessimistic that an agreement will be reached. And even if it is, it's going to be a very minor and thin agreement.
I see. The Biden administration, likely to come into power January the 20th, has been talking about rallying the allies and to be able to reach consensus. And that's, of course, a huge difference compared to the current president. So, Mr. Eland, observing from where you are, how do you see what's going on between the EU and the UK? Where is this opportunity, if there is any, for Biden administration to pick up?
Oh, I think the UK might be in a little bit of a pickle because, it has to negotiate with the EU, but the Biden administration is not probably as prone to bail out Johnson if he fails in that. So I think, and then of course we have what are the long-term implications of Trump's vast change in policy on, burden sharing for NATO, trade with the EU.
How much do you think the President-elect Biden will be able to turn that picture around?
It's not just Trump. I think the United States on those issues that I mentioned has, turned inward to some extent, particularly on the security side and
Yes.
burden sharing in NATO and that sort of thing. So I think that, and that's quote unquote U.S. leadership. I think the Europeans would probably be better off if they relied less on the United States.
Will the European be better off? Mr. Martin, what has been this articulation on the European continent? Of course, countries vary from one and to another.
I think it's a bit early to say what will a Biden administration do. At the very least, you're going to see a significant change in style and tone. And I don't think that should be downplayed entirely. At the very least, we will not see insults by tweets. We won't see that form of diplomacy, which I think was particularly grating. But it is a fair question from the European allies, which is, to what extent, can we trust the American word? I think that's the big issue, because American politics, domestic politics, has been shown to pivot quite dramatically from Obama to Trump. Who is to say that we will not see a new dramatic pivot 4 or 8 years from now? And so the question is, can you make any agreement with the United States that is going to have some longevity, that is going to be enshrined on a more permanent basis? And I think that's a fundamental question for the Europeans here. At the very least, they will welcome Joe Biden as a known commodity. They will welcome a return to a more predictable and stable form of diplomacy when the people that Joe Biden has surrounded himself in terms of his appointments are very much professionals with experience. That will be welcome. But still, there's still some fundamental questions for the Europeans about to what extent will American domestic politics prevent a more radical attempt at repairing the relations.
Professor Laris, you are in U.S. You're originally from Germany. So I guess you are in both worlds. Probably you can help us to understand better also about that.
Yeah, I think both the American people and the Europeans were quite lucky, and they know that. It could easily have resulted in another second Trump administration, in an election victory by President Trump, which would have been a disaster, both for American domestic policy and for transatlantic relations.
The entry point for the transatlantic relations to be repaired, what are some of these options?
The summit of democracy, which Biden wants to have within the first few months of his administration, that is very much welcomed by the Europeans. That would be one good starting point. Also, cooperation on climate change and greenhouse effects and emission standards. I think both sides agree on that.
Yeah.
There are other things like Iran, also relations with China, trade relations, the imposition of the lifting of sanctions on steel and aluminium, which the Trump administration imposed on the Europeans. These are issues which are much more difficult to resolve, but they will be, or the Biden administration will be quickly confronted with them. And I think the transatlantic allies first want to get off on a good start and then really tackle the more difficult issues after perhaps a few months.
On the one hand, there is a bigger chance that the transatlantic relations might be having a better momentum than over the past 4 years. On the other hand, both China is working with the United States, hopefully the new administration, to repair the relation, and also now China is working with the EU on the bilateral investment treaty. Some were suggesting even by the end of the year. Now, we do not have any inside information about whether that's likely to happen or not, but certainly that's a great momentum. So, Mr. Liu, how is China looking at this transatlantic evolution, as we speak, leading up to January the 20th?
Here in China, we are happy to see the improvement of the bilateral relation between the two sides, because the two sides can together do a lot of contribution to the international issues. For example, the climate change and the biodiversity and other regional international security issues. And also, there are also concerns here in China about whether the two sides will coordinate with each other about the policy towards China. But my personal view is that the bilateral relation is important, but it's not all about China. I read the policy paper which is launched by the European Commission just the beginning of December. When you read this paper, you will find that there are a lot of issues between United States and Europe. Right. There may be 100 issues, and when you will find that there is only a small part which is related directly to China. I think good relations between China and the United States, and I think it's possible during Biden's administration when it may happen. And China, I think, will continue to work closely with the European partners. For example, the BIT agreement, yes, it's a closed-door negotiation, but as far as the signals which have been released so far, we have the reasons to expect a finalization of this agreement.
You know, one of the things people have been talking about is whether the U.S. will, with the new administration, will try to use the ideology and political system as a rallying force with the traditional allies because there are a lack of other options to work together or have a common ground so far. And that could be, to a certain extent, directed at China, which, of course, is having a very different political system. Now, we don't want to compare one system to another because I really don't know which one is better. But many suggest that this could be problematic both for China and for the long-term relationship of cooperation between China and the EU and China and the U.S.
I think it's reasonable to think about the Biden's policy towards China in this way, because Biden is calling for a summit of democracies, and he may ask the traditional partners to follow his policy towards China. But the truth is that I don't think the European Union and Japan and other countries will totally follow the Biden's administration. I don't think so, because there are too many issues between these countries with the United States. To some, they will have more consensus, but there are still divisions between the United States and the partners. It's very difficult for these countries to make consensus on all these issues. And particularly in terms of its policy towards China, Europe will have its own considerations. For the United States, I think China may be named as a strategic competitor. For the European Union, I think China is still a very important trade partner. At least it's not a strategic competitor, which means EU will take different positions.
It's really not about one hedge toward another, or encircling of one country or another. But Mr. Eland, there is a fundamental lack of trust, not only between China and the United States, but also between the U.S. and the EU, and to a certain extent also between China and the EU. Do you see hope that any side, between any two major players, that trust can be quickly repaired?
China has both the trade issue and the security issue in the South China Sea. So there's two sets of issues there with U.S. and China. So I think the U.S. and EU probably have a better chance of repairing relations. I agree with my colleagues, though. I think Biden will bring more professionalism and also the atmospherics will improve. It doesn't take away all the issues, of course, as I mentioned. There are factors in the United States. So, for instance, if you go back to the 2016 presidential campaign, Hillary Clinton took a turn for the protectionist, view during that election. So there are elements of the Democratic Party that have always been protectionist, and it was the Republicans for a long time that were the free trade, at least in the last few decades. And now they're both more protectionist. So that's one aspect, and it's just an example of long-term trends in the United States. So there will be some continuity in the inward turning of the United States. We also have a huge national debt, which was exacerbated greatly by the Trump administration and the Obama administration before that. So that's another issue here, that the U.S. doesn't have as much flexibility in its budget to do everything that it wants and it did before.
So, Mr. Martin, I really wondered, how much could the EU be able to push using its bargaining power of timing and playing this middle role between China and the United States, be able to achieve? To what extent can they push? What timetable is the best for them to push? These are very interesting questions we talk about if we talk about concrete.
And this is, I think, a very important point, both for Europe and for the United States. Public opinion has shifted, and this is a key factor here. Much like those large ocean cruisers, they move slowly, but when they start shifting, it's very hard to change them. Public opinion has hardened towards China and the United States, and I would say we're seeing similar signs in Europe. And I think that's a source of concern in the long run, because you're right, personalities may want to patch, they may want to reset relations, but they face real-world constraints. And public opinion, I think, is a very important one. There is, I disagree a little bit with Klaus there. I think trust matters, but maybe more on the issue of public opinion here. There is less trust amongst the European public towards China in the wake of the pandemic, and also because of other persistent problems over market access, intellectual property. So it's not that it cannot be repaired, but it's a significant obstacle. Secondly, I would say on your question about the timing for the Europeans, I think what they're doing right now is smart and something they should have done before, which is not just to wait for American leadership, but to come up with concrete plan and concrete asks. So what do the Europeans can bring to the table? Now, the one tension is that even for the EU or for the United States, that to a varying degree view China as a competitor or the rival, there's still an understanding that they will need to work with China on certain key issues like climate change. So there's a bit of a tension. Do you favor to work with like-minded states, or do you agree to work with states who have different models of governance that you may or may not approve of, but you have to work with them on key issues?
The U.S. withdrew as a nation from two important international platforms. One is the Paris Climate Agreement. The other is World Health Organization. Now, I remember for any country and economies to join certain kinds of platforms, there are rules, and there is entry price. So now it is only interesting to see whether there will be equal treatment to the United States as well when they try to, if under a new administration, subscribing to a global cooperation, be treated also in the same way that the other countries' economies are being treated. That, to me, is a very interesting question. Professor Laris.
Yeah, there should be. I quite agree. But as you know, big countries, be it China, be it Russia, be it the United States, are always treated slightly more equal than anywhere else. It may not be totally fair and correct, but that's the way the world is. And I think China and the United States have here quite a bit in common. Regarding the changes in the economic trading
in that regard, I'm afraid I have to beg to differ. When China joins the WTO, there was an enormous amount of negotiations between China and the United States and every other trading partners. And that is not necessarily what you have just talked about. But also, on the other hand, when there's a Paris climate change agreement, we all know every economy has to make their commitment and implement their commitment, not withdraw and coming in every 4 years. So what about that? What does that mean for the international mechanism, credibility of it? I'm not sure having an excuse saying it's a big country and therefore let's go would be the way for others to follow. China could do the same. EU could do the same, right?
No, but when you look, in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, it was, of course, not yet a superpower. It was trying to get there. So you can't compare the China of 2001 with the China of today. When you look at the World Trade Organization, for example, both China and the United States really take liberties with that forum. They really, neither of them plays properly by the rules, and neither of the big powers does.
Well, it depends on what do you mean the rules are, and also it depends on who is judging on the rules. If I understand, there are lawsuits going on between China and EU, China, US, US and EU, which waiting for the appellate body, which of course does not exist anymore because the US has been trying to suspend the voting of the candidates for the appellate body. So it really depends on what do you mean by the rules and who is regarding the rules. Anyway, I don't want to go into details about it. Let's focus on the question of whether the U.S. should abide by the commitments of these international organizations and platforms when they join in. What do you think will be the position of the EU, Mr. Laris?
Yes, they of course want to see that the United States rejoin certain international organizations, like the Paris Climate Treaty, like the World Health Organization, and also, for example, the Iranian nuclear deal. And if the United States were prepared to do that, and regarding Iran, that is an open question, we really don't know, then I'm sure they will close both eyes in order to facilitate America's re-entry.
Mr. Martin, your take, very briefly also.
It's not only about returning to these international institutions. It's also about addressing some of the broader problems that we've seen before. One of the big concerning lessons of the last 4 or 5 years is the extent to which all of these important guardrails to keep international stability have been slowly but surely eroded. That's when a big power leaves international agreements. That's an issue. That is a concern. Are we going to see a change in that trend in the next 4 years of states working together to rebuild international governance? Or are we going to see this further fragmentation, which I would argue would ultimately be of benefit to no one?
Professor Liu from Beijing.
I think it's the situation that will decide the policies of the United States and Europe. And to that, in this respect, I think we cannot expect too much of the improvement of the bilateral relations between European Union and the United States, because there is a limit, because the situation has changed. Now Europe is not the core of the world, it's the Asia, maybe Pacific. So I think the United States may not spend too much money and energy on its relations with Europe. That's why Europe cannot trust the United States as it used to.
Interesting. Mr. Eland, your final take also.
Yeah, I would agree with my colleagues. I think big powers run the system, as we see in the UN Security Council and other organizations. And I think in all 3 cases, the Iran Treaty, the climate change, and the World Health Organization, I think those organizations will be delighted to get the United States back. For the Health Organization, U.S. medical technology, for climate change, because we're a big carbon emitter.
Ivan Eland, Klaus Laris, Garrett Martin, last but not least, Liu Min Li. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us and helping us understand insights from different perspectives. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.